move into the reading for the sermon. And this is taken from Mark chapter 15, entitled The Death of Jesus. When it was noon, night fell over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, listen, Jesus is calling for Elijah. Someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to Jesus to drink, saying, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take Jesus down. Then Jesus gave a loud cry and died. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing Jesus saw that Jesus had died in this way, he said, truly, this was the child of God. So this morning when I was meditating, I received the guidance to talk about crucifixion. Because crucifixion is something that each one of us will experience on the path. Of course, Jesus did it outwardly, and we will experience crucifixion inwardly. It isn't something that you should worry about because, well, that's what I want to talk about today. All of us are familiar with the time when on our phones we begin to get a very low amount of charge. You see, usually there's your bars now have a little tiny amount of juice left and it's red. And I don't know, maybe it starts around 15%. Definitely by the time you're at 10%, there's a warning like you're running out of juice. And I saw that as an image for how most of us arrive to begin the path. That our true selves are down around 10% juice. And the false self has become 90% of how we live. And there's a certain direness about when you get down to 10%. The red is coming like you better do something. You need to get recharged. And so we begin the process of learning how to plug into the way so that true self can start to get recharged back up. And that's about where the phone metaphor starts to fail. Because when you plug in a charger, especially these days, within an hour, hour and a half, you're back to full 100%. But on the spiritual path, it doesn't happen that way. The false self fights pretty hard to stay alive. When you are asked to let go of things, like every year around just before Easter, we recommend you do a thorough cleaning of your house. And I actually recommend that you go through all your possessions, maybe not all your stuff at your storage locker, but basically you go through your possessions, and if you haven't touched anything or you haven't touched a particular thing in 12 to 18 months, you should get rid of it. And trust that if you need something like that again, then you can go and buy it. And some people go, I want to give that a shot. And they go to their closet and all of a sudden, oh, I remember this, and I used to look so good in that. And then it's like, well, I got this box of love letters back from this decade of my life, and oh, I'm reading it, remember we were so happy. You know. So there's a type of nostalgia, a type of connection to these things. Why? Because at some point, they worked for us. And the false self is very much like that. This path very much is about, it's time to let go of the false self. And eventually, when the false self, you've really disassociated from it, you really don't want to be that way, then God will crucify it. And that will be the end of it. That part of you will be dead. The reason that we don't just, move really quickly to that place is because we have a nostalgia for the false self. I mean, initially we may still go, yeah, but this still works for me. What do I mean by that? Well, if I get angry, this is how I typically respond. So sometimes I withdraw from people and I let them know that I'm angry because I no longer show up for them. I give them a little time out so they can see what they did. Or I get angry and I lay into them because, hey, you got to keep it real. Or I get really anxious and I get really nervous, so I start to tighten up and I start to withdraw from taking any chances. And that works for me because then I don't potentially get hurt. or I don't find myself in a situation where I don't know what to do. Or there's a certain amount of emotional pressure in my environment, so then I reach for something to drink, or I reach for a joint, or I vacate and I stop being real and I start being fake. And that works for me because then nobody really questions it. You're saying I should actually speak up, and I'm like, well, that wouldn't work in this environment. So the false self exists for a reason, and it has served you to a certain point. This path begins to put pressure. As we charge by plugging into the way that Jesus teaches, the pressure is now to let go of the false self, to realize that those associations and the way that the false self served you in the past, okay, we accept it. We can't look back at how we were and hate ourselves, because that's not what Jesus teaches. He doesn't teach that you would hate. He says, love your enemies. So you could think of the false self to a certain degree as an enemy, because it did not want you to be in God. It wanted you to be preserved and seen as somebody who had it all together, or somebody who knew what to do, or somebody who's powerful or sexy, or who knows what. And now you're going, I don't believe in that anymore. Enough of you is going, I don't believe in that anymore, but there are remnants of you that go like, I'm not quite ready to let it go. Because if I let it go, what happens next? Well, this is why it's so beautiful. We know in the gospel that what happens next is there's a period where we don't know where Jesus is. You know, they say it's 3 days. It actually, he died Friday and he comes back Sunday. So it's not really 3 days, but it's a period where we don't know. Like, think about where people were at on Saturday. They didn't know what was going to happen. Yeah, Jesus told them over and over again, on the third day I will rise again. But they're sitting and huddling, the apostles, going like, what do we do now? So we forget that when the false self is crucified, that the Christed self will emerge. So you have to have faith that that's going to happen. And that faith is built up over time because you let go of certain aspects and you see that you don't need them. And you learn to live without them. And at times they pull you back because you feel tested. You feel like you're put through something difficult and you're not sure you can do it without your drugs or your cigarettes or your alcohol or your sugar or your, that's all the physical stuff, or without your withdrawing or getting angry or getting paranoid or getting anxious or getting depressed. These things are expressions of the false self. The moment of crucifixion is different for everybody. And I can understand being nervous about it because, it sounds scary. When something dies, we don't yet know where is the new life yet. This is the essence of what makes living by faith difficult, is that you have to trust in something before you see what's coming. So then it makes sense that you have beings that are further along who've been through it, who can stand here and go like, I know what it says here, but this actually is true. I have experienced this. Because if you didn't have that, the mind starts to go like, well, I've heard a lot of things that the Bible is not really true. You shouldn't take it literal. It's just kind of a metaphor, so. But when you have somebody in front of you who is saying, this is the way, then it gives you some more confidence in what you need to do. And yet ultimately that's still not necessarily enough, because at some point you have to take those clothes and that box of love letters and that old bike or whatever it is, and you have to put it on the curb and go, it's finished. I don't want this as a reminder of who I used to be. I want to be who God intended me to be. So I fall on my knees that night and I go, God, I'm ready. Crucify any parts of my false self that I no longer need. And I'll let you decide what that is, not me. Those are bold prayers, because we don't know what's going to happen. Because sometimes in order for something to die, a situation has to show up, and then you see that the old you is no longer there. So that's scary, right? Because maybe we're projecting, well, it's going to be a horrible situation. Well, maybe it's not. You have to be willing to go, whatever it is, I called forth that prayer and God is answering it. So it has to be good. And that's cool.